Okay, that is.
Yeah.
So Rose and Jane, who are committee members, who are part of this group, well, they let people into the meeting. So doors open, as it were, just like in the theatre, and Rose and Jane let our members in. And there's a little greeting to people and everything, and it's we used to meet in the Salvation Army Hall in Paisley, and we try as much as possible to make it like that, as much as we can, so that it's a kind of natural experience. So then at 2 o'clock, this screenshot will come on, just welcoming everybody.
Yeah, that's a beautiful picture there.
Yeah, this is of Paisley.
Lovely, isn't it?
It's beautiful. It's a lovely, lovely place. It's really very photogenic, I think. And then I come on.
The absolute best of theatre. Wonderful music, wonderful shows generally, and so well put together and so well enjoyed by so many people. I think to get an idea of the partnership, I think it's good if we could first of all look at both of the characters involved. W.S. Gilbert, the writer, well, his full name was William Schwenk Gilbert. He was the wordsman. He did everything as far as the written word is concerned and the production was concerned. Gilbert attended to it. Arthur Sullivan, the composer, he was the music man. He just did the music. I don't mean just did, I mean it was an enormous thing to do, but he never got involved on the words. But that was the brilliance of the partnership. A wonderful wordsman working with a wonderful composer that together gave us these delightful shows. But two very complex characters. And I think it's good to get an idea of the way they worked and how they were as people. And I think we get a better understanding of the shows that they produced. W.S. Gilbert was extremely wealthy. His family were descendants from the Gilbert family of Walter Raleigh's time in Devon. They had a country estate in Hampshire, a townhouse in London. Very, very wealthy family. Gilbert was not a person that really had to work or do anything to earn a living. He didn't need the money, certainly. But he had studied law. He was born in 1836, and in the late 1850s, he set himself up as a barrister. And it wasn't long before Gilbert realized that law in Victorian Britain was an absolute ass. He was appalled at how corrupt everything was. He was appalled that it didn't matter what your crime was. Providing you put enough money in a brown paper envelope, you're going to get off anyway. He felt he could not carry on life as a lawyer. He was so appalled by the whole situation. He began to write about his experiences. He began to write and think about life generally. And he was a prolific writer. He was a man with a social conscience, and that's a very important thing to remember. He looked at Victorian society, realized about the haves and the have-nots, particularly focusing on the fact that in Victorian Britain, after the Industrial Revolution period, only 5% of the people in Britain benefited from the revolution. 95% of the people lived in awful working life conditions, awful home conditions, hard working conditions. Gilbert felt for these people. He started writing about it. He started writing about social issues and considering about life generally. As a writer, he became a member of the Garrick Club in London, and there he met Charles Dickens. Dickens was 30 years Gilbert's senior, but if you look at the style of Dickens' work and Gilbert's work as a writer, you will see a lot of similarities. Both talked about industrial issues, both talked about social issues and issues like that. Gilbert was a prolific writer, but the great thing of Gilbert was he always wrote with a twinkle in his eye. He was able to make people laugh at themselves. For example, he wrote a play called Etiquette. It was about two British sailors who who were shipwrecked on a desert island in the South Pacific. And they lived on the desert island for 5 years, but they didn't speak to each other because they hadn't been introduced. Very much Gilbert looking at the stupidities of Victorian society and throwing it back at them, making them look at themselves. Brilliant, brilliant writer. He was not a musician. Gilbert once said, "I only know 2 pieces of music. One is God Save the Queen and the other isn't." So he was never a man that was going to get involved in music. He was a writer. He wrote books. He started writing dramas. He was becoming interested in the theatre. So in the late 1860s, you have a wonderful wordsman, but still without a partner. So let's see about Arthur Sullivan. Arthur Sullivan couldn't have been more different. He was born in 1842. His family were an Irish immigrant family that had settled in a rough area of South London in Lambeth. They were very, very poor. His father was a trumpet player in the Surrey Music Hall. But Arthur Sullivan was a boy with a great musical feeling. By the age of 10, he'd written a couple of anthems. By the age of 17, he won a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music. And most importantly, at the age of 19, in 1861, he won the Mendelssohn Scholarship to study in Leipzig. And he went to Germany for 5 years, very much on the path of becoming a classical composer. He was studying melody. He was studying orchestration. He was studying the nuts and bolts of how music comes together. He became very enthusiastic with a lot of the great European composers. For example, he found 5 lost works of Schubert, which he reorchestrated and put together at concerts in Germany in the late 1860s, and at that time was making a name for himself as a up-and-coming classical composer in the biggest sense. However, one of the people that Sullivan met in Leipzig was Rossini. And Rossini said, "I always felt that we should write music for the theatre like we write music for the grand opera or the symphony, properly orchestrated, properly put together, and bringing music to more people." Sullivan was a fun-loving man. Having been so poor in his childhood, he thought the opportunity of writing music for more people, to bring music for a general mass of people, would be a wonderful thing to do as well. And he got that opportunity in 1867 when, with F.C. Burnand, he wrote the music for a piece called Cox and Box. Cox and Box was produced in London in 1867 and was really well received. At that time, W.S. Gilbert was a newspaper critic for a major newspaper, and he went along as a theatre critic to see Cox and Box, and he enjoyed it. Now, bearing in mind he wasn't a musician, but he liked the idea of this play with music, and he became friends with Arthur Sullivan, and they talked a lot about doing some projects together. And when in 1871, W.S. Gilbert himself was running a theatre in the Regent Street area of London, and he had a play which he'd written, and he asked Arthur Sullivan if he would set it to music. And so the very first Gilbert and Sullivan production was on the 26th of December, 1871, and it was called Thespis. I probably expect most of you may not have heard of Thespis, which is not such a bad thing, because actually it was pretty rotten, to be fair. It wasn't a success at all. I think the main reason it wasn't a success was it was badly rehearsed. It was under-rehearsed. It was put on in about a week. It hadn't been put together, hadn't been thought about very well, but more than anything, it was rather a silly storyline. It was about a group of Greek gods who were fed up with being Greek gods, who met a group of Greek actors who were fed up with being Greek actors, so they changed places. It was a bit of a hocus pocus nonsense, and the public didn't like it. And in fact, after 11 days, it failed and went away. Gilbert and Sullivan went separate ways. Gilbert went on with his drama work, and Sullivan, in the period 18 1874, was the period when Sullivan was prolific as a writer of church music. In that 2-year period, he wrote 71 church hymns, many of which we know today, like Onward Christian Soldiers, or that hymn that was in the Titanic, Nearer My God to Thee, or the Christmas hymn, It Came Upon the Midnight Clear. All these things Sullivan was doing and really made a name for himself as the musician in the church music. Is everything all right with the Zoom? The Zoom's gone funny. That's better. Is it all right again? Yeah, it went off completely. Anyway, is everybody right? And so it might have been that was the end of their partnership, but there's another side to the story. In 1875, another theatre producer, Richard Doyley Cart, was running a series of Offenbach shows, which weren't satisfying his audiences, and he wanted something else for his theatre. And he remembered Thespis. He was the only person in Victorian Britain that did remember Thespis, but it's glad that he did, because he brought Gilbert and Sullivan back together again, and they wrote a piece for Doyley Cart's theatre in 1875. And that piece was Trial by Jury. Trial by Jury was an immediate success. And it was a success because, first of all, Sullivan's music was of a much higher tempo and a much better put together than in Thespis. But other than that, Gilbert was writing about something he knew about. He was writing about the law, and he was writing about the corruptness and the terrible situation of law in Victorian Britain. For example, the judge in Trial by Jury says, all thieves who could my fees afford relied on my orations, and many a burglar I restore to his friends and his relations. People loved it. Audiences loved it. They loved the fact that here was somebody brave enough to lampoon an institution such as the law. People were coming to the theatre in droves. Richard Doyley Cart immediately wanted Gilbert and Sullivan to write another piece, which they immediately did. And in 1877, you had The Sorcerer. The Sorcerer is the first one of the shows where Gilbert starts to talk about inequalities of society, something he felt so strongly about. He wanted to talk about how, for example, in The Sorcerer, the village maiden cannot marry the lord of the manor because of difference of social class. And it was something he felt very strongly about and very dear about. If we look at the whole of these 14 shows in the Gilbert and Sullivan series, we must also remember each and every time the value of the words, because Gilbert's words always have something to say. He is always bringing up a subject that he feels has to be talked about. And that, matched to Sullivan's music, is the great quality and the great heritage of the GNS works altogether. These words with meaning linked with the most beautiful music. And that is quite a rare combination. It was a brave combination because Gilbert was never frightened about taking on what he thought was needed to be discussed and talked about as wrong with the establishment. And that really began in a big way in 1878 with HMS Pinafore. HMS Pinafore was written at the time when Gilbert wanted to talk about the Prime Minister of the day, Benjamin Disraeli, and the wrongdoings of government at that time. What had happened, for example, was that Benjamin Disraeli had made W.H. Smith, the High Street stationer that we all know of, he'd made W.H. Smith First Lord of the Admiralty. Never been to sea in his life, never seen a ship in his life, yet he was put in charge of the Navy. So in HMS Pinafore, Gilbert says, stick close to your desk and never go to sea, and you all can be rulers of the Queen's Navy. Disraeli went a step further. He made W.H. Smith a member of Parliament. So Gilbert said, I always voted at my party's call, and I never thought of thinking for myself at all. I thought so little they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. This was strong words. This was somebody really anti-government, anti-establishment, getting away with it though. Sullivan's music softens the blow. But it was even more than that. Gilbert again started talking about the issue of inequality in society and the problems of social class. In the show, you have the situation where the captain's daughter falls in love with a sailor. And she says to her father that she wants to marry this sailor. And the father says, but my dear, he is a lowly sailor. You are a captain's daughter. And then she says, but father, you said we are all equal. And the captain says, well, so we are, but some of us are more equal than others. Very pertinent point and a very strong point to put across. But I said at the beginning about how Gilbert was a person that wanted to write about social issues. And he had a wonderful way of writing and a wonderful way of putting across his thoughts in a very succinct and straightforward way, never any waffle. Let me just read you, please, a piece from HMS Pinafore where the captain's daughter is talking about how her life would be. She's comparing her life living with her father and how it would be if she married a lowly sailor. And she says this, and it's only 12 lines, but it is a wonderful picture of Victorian society. She says, on the one hand, I live in Papa's luxurious home, hung with ancestral armour and old brasses, carved oak and tapestry from distant Rome, rich oriental rugs, luxurious sofa pillows, and everything that isn't old is from Gillows. But on the other hand, I would live in a dark and dingy room in some back street with stuffy children crying, where organs yell and clacking housewives fume, and clothes are hanging out all day a drying, with one cracked-looking glass to see my face in, and horror dinner served up in a pudding basin. That is a pretty wonderful picture of Victorian society, and it's given to us in just 12 lines. The beauty is Gilbert's words matched with Sullivan's music. Throughout their 25-year partnership, there was never an occasion that Gilbert and Sullivan fell foul of the Lord Chamberlain, or anybody sued them, or anybody took issue with them. And I'm sure it is because always Sullivan's music is there to soften the blow. It takes away the edge of the word, but it does more than that. Sullivan was brilliant in adding crescendo and sound to the most pertinent points that Gilbert wanted to say. Iolanthe, for example, that great political piece where you get the House of Lords visiting the peasants in the country. Bow, bow, ye lower middle classes. We are peers of highest station, paragons of the British nation. You lot, you're nobody. Sullivan's music there and the crescendo he brings to it is absolutely brilliant and adds to the strength and marvelousness of the words. And that, I think, is a very pertinent thing to say about the partnership, because Gilbert never interfered with the music and Sullivan never interfered with the words. Sometimes people say, well, Gilbert was a complete radical. He was an anti-establishment. I don't know if Sullivan was. Well, I think Sullivan must have been as well, because I don't think the situation would have arisen that Sullivan would have happily set the words to music if he violently disagreed with what they've been talked about. And I think that is the brilliance of it. Henry Wood, Sir Henry Wood, as I should say, the great promenade man, said in 1921, if I may just read it, it's an absolute perfect idea. He said, Gilbert and Sullivan are like two masters playing a concerto. Neither is subordinate to the other, and neither predominates. They are in perfect harmony with each other. It is a wonderful harmony of words and music, and that's what makes these works so utterly unique. And they are utterly unique in that respect. You have a brilliant writer and a brilliant composer. And the fact that the words are so vital and cannot be overlooked, it leads me to the next thought, really. What is Gilbert and Sullivan? Because Gilbert and Sullivan never ever called their works opera. And I suppose if you look upon a Tosca or Aida or something like that, they're not opera in that sense of the word, but neither are they operetta. Because if you think of the European style of operetta, as beautiful as the shows are, the words often don't have a lot of meaning. I mean, for example, The Merry Widow, we know Frances Ha wrote the music, but I don't know who the librettist is because nobody's particularly bothered. It's not worrying what they're talking about. But you can't say that with GNS because the words are so vital. But where I think they are placed, and now more and more so, this thought is coming to people are talking about more and more, Gilbert and Sullivan are the origins of what we now know as musical theatre. What they did in the Victorian period is they were the Les Miserables of the Victorian period. They were the Mamma Mia, if you like, of the Victorian period, because Gilbert and Sullivan were the pop music of the Victorian period, and that we must remember. People would play it on the street corner. They would go to the park and hear it on the bandstand. They would rush out and buy the music as soon as the show was produced. It was so utterly popular. Now, if you think of it like that, it begins to make a lot of sense, I think, because if you look at the history of musical theatre and you read about some of the great American composers, you start seeing people like Leonard Bernstein said he would never have written West Side Story had he not been influenced by Gilbert and Sullivan. Cole Porter said the same. Jerome Kern said the same. Jerome Kern, in fact, when he was writing his wonderful show, Showboat, in 1926, and he realized he was writing about a political problem and a social problem of the Mississippi people. And he said, I'm wondering how I can make this into a musical. And he said, well, of course I can. Gilbert and Sullivan were doing the very same thing 50 years beforehand, taking political issues and social issues and including it as part of the show. So I think it's brilliant to say that musical theatre as we know it didn't start in Broadway in the 1930s. It started in Britain in the 1870s with Gilbert and Sullivan. And what a wonderful range of shows they produced over the years. Mikado, written in 1885, of course, is the most well-known and the most popular of it. And for many, many reasons, it is worthy of it. I mean, everybody has different shows that they say are the best or they prefer, but Mikado, even now, in 2019 even, the Mikado was said to be the most played piece of musical theatre anywhere in the world, ever. And that's still going strong. It was a brilliant piece. Gilbert had been to see a Japanese exhibition in London in Knightsbridge, and it gave him a wonderful idea to write his next piece, but to use it as a Japanese setting as a camouflage. Because the Mikado is not a story about Japan. It's a story about the corruptness of the British government and the British political system, put within a Japanese camouflage. That wonderful line from the Mikado, where Pooh Bah, who is the most corrupt politician you will ever think of meeting, says, as Parliamentary Paymaster General, I could so fiddle my expenses that the Lord High Auditor would not find out. 130 years later, those idiots in Westminster fiddled their expenses. So it just shows you, doesn't it, the brilliance of Gilbert's mind and his thoughts. And of course, it's interesting to note that the Mikado is a very popular show in Japan. They do enjoy it, they do love it, because they don't see it as a skit or anything about the Japanese. They just see it for what it is, a political comment of Victorian Britain in a Japanese setting. There have been some very wonderful productions, by the way, by several companies in Japan, and at the International GNS Festival about 10 years ago, one of the companies from Tokyo bought their Mikado. It was a fantastic show, so very well done, and showing the brilliance of the piece altogether. Gilbert and Sullivan were never fighting shy of the authorities. They never bothered about who they wanted to talk about. Gilbert was just wanting always to be sure, and Sullivan was there to add his weight to what was being said. Iolanthe, that great political piece written in 1882, where Gilbert talks about Westminster. When in that house MPs divide, if they have a brain and cerebellum too, they've got to leave that brain outside and vote just as their leaders tell them to. What is the Houses of Parliament? It's a place full of dull MPs in close proximity. He said about the House of Lords. The House of Lords do nothing in particular, do it rather well, I suppose. I mean, wonderful, wonderful comments all the time, keeping the shows so fresh. I think when Gilbert was writing, he was always particularly keen to talk about issues which he saw through history as being problems. And I bet he thought in his mind, you know, in 100 years' time, these will still be issues. And of course, they are still issues. And this is one of the things that is keeping these shows so very much alive, thinking about these societies. I don't know if Gilbert and Sullivan actually had much influence on changes. They did in some respects, I think, but not overall, because, you know, like British society doesn't particularly like to be told where they're not doing things right. But in The Pirates of Penzance, which was written in 1879, Gilbert, with his knowledge and of the law, and particularly of the police force, he said that the British police force are useless, they're inept, they just don't want to get involved. They'll do anything not to get involved. So in HMS Pinafore, where the police are called in to round up the pirates, you get the scene where the police are doing whatever they can think of so as not to get involved. They showed themselves up to be an absolute shower. Now, that did have an effect, because that was written in 1879. And in the 1880s, there were major changes made to the police force. And it could be said that perhaps Gilbert had some influence on that, because he was really showing up for it to be inept as it really was. And that's a lovely point. It wasn't always politicians that he tracked. In Princess Ida, in 1883, he wanted to talk about the role of women in society, something he felt strongly about. And he said in Princess Ida, there should be education for women, there should be universities for women. Victorian Britain, this is quite a controversial thought. Now, when the university is set up, Princess Ida and her pals, they gather in the university, they talk about the sort of things they should be doing. And they say, what we must achieve is votes for women. Think of that date, 1883. Gilbert is advocating votes for women, 30 years before Mrs. Pankhurst was doing that same thing. But brilliantly, brilliantly done. An absolute brilliant man, and able to do it and able to get away with it. And he got away with it all the time, as I say again, because Arthur Sullivan's music was always there to soften the blow. It took the edge from the words. It made it acceptable. And I think that's a lovely thought. If you look at a social history of the British theatre, you will always see it referred to the fact that before GNS, people from all walks of life never went to the theatre together. The upper classes went to the drama or the opera, and the lower classes went to the musical. But with GNS, people from all walks of life came into the theatre to see the same show together. And that was a first. So if anybody ever says to me, oh, GNS, oh, I don't like that, they have a lot to thank them for. They revolutionized British theatre. It made it acceptable for everybody to come together. But what a lovely thought. You had the position then that the lower classes sitting in the balcony will be laughing cock-a-hoop at what Gilbert was saying about the people sitting in the stalls, the richer people. And those in the stall said, oh, Mr. Sullivan's music is very nice. We don't always hear all the words, which just proves the point, really, that everybody was made happy. But what a clever thing these two did doing that, you know. They really deserve their place in history from this wonderful, wonderful work that they did. But they were two different characters. And it's often said, oh, isn't it a fact that Gilbert and Sullivan hated each other? No, they did not hate each other. They worked together for 25 years. And as in any business partnership for 25 years, there are arguments or differences of opinion. And so there were. And it came about with Gilbert and Sullivan mainly because of money. You know, for all their wealth, and they were getting extremely wealthy. After all, they built the Savoy Hotel, the Savoy Theatre, they built 3 or 4 other theatres. They were extremely wealthy. But Gilbert was a miserable man on money. He wouldn't spend a penny if he didn't have to. He just refused to spend money. And Sullivan, because of his poor upbringing, he did what he thought you're anything you must do when you get money, and that's spend it. So, for example, when the Mikado was produced in 1885, Sullivan thought, oh, I know, wonderful idea. We'll import silk from Japan. We'll get the dresses made up by the best costumiers. It will be wonderful. And so it was. But the bill came to £16,500, which in 1885 was a lot of money. Gilbert went berserk and really fell out and went really into a big huff for weeks on end and didn't talk to anybody. But then he'd come round, he'd think of a new show, he'd think of a new drama, and he'd be ready and he'd be friends again and they'd be back together again. When The Gondoliers was written in 1889, there's a wonderful exchange of correspondence after the opening night, which again had proved that the show was going to be a big success. Sullivan wrote to Gilbert and said, I hope that The Gondoliers is a shining light into the next century. And if it is, it's because I owe everything to you for your brilliant drama, for your brilliant words. You are the mainstay of our partnership. And Gilbert wrote to Sullivan and said, no, it is I who should be thanking you. We are where we're at because of your brilliant music and your brilliant composition. I owe everything to you. And that's the thing. Neither Gilbert or Sullivan probably wouldn't have been anything without the other. That's a little bit unfair to say in some respects, because Arthur Sullivan was also having a second life as a musician, and some brilliant works he did as well. His Irish Symphony, to celebrate his Irish upbringing, for example, is a beautiful piece. He wrote an oratorio called The Golden Legend. And many people today say The Golden Legend is second only to The Messiah as the greatest oratorio ever written. In 1882, Sullivan was made what you would call it really court musician by Queen Victoria. He was the man, whenever there was a state occasion, he would write music for that occasion. Also in 1882, Queen Victoria knighted Arthur Sullivan for his services to music. W.S. Gilbert was not knighted. He'd obviously upset so many of the establishment by that time that there was no question of Gilbert getting a knighthood. But it didn't affect their professional relationship. They went on producing these wonderful shows. And there's always one show in the series which is nice to talk about, which is different, with Yeoman of the Guard. Yeoman of the Guard was written in 1888, and it came about because Gilbert had seen an advertisement for the Tower Furnishing Company. And he thought, I must write a piece about the Tower of London, and I must set it in a Tudor setting, because I know that Arthur Sullivan loves everything to do with the Tudor period, and it will give Arthur Sullivan such a delight to write music based on the Tudor period. Again, doesn't that show the respect that they must have had for each other, rather than any sort of dislike? And of course, The Yeoman of the Guard is a completely different show altogether. It's the only one without very much, there's no satire in The Yeoman of the Guard. It's a human storyline. And in the end of Act 2, one of the characters actually dies. Richard Doyley Cart, the company manager at the time, was very concerned that there should be a G&S show where somebody dies. And he didn't really want it to be like that, but Gilbert stuck to his guns and he insisted that that was how it to be. And the show is very much accepted with that. It's accepted as being a completely different style of G&S work altogether. And here's another thing which I think is quite interesting. When Sullivan was setting it to music, he was looking at the words that Gilbert had written for a piece which is called Is Life a Boon? And Sullivan said, I think that is the most beautiful piece of words I have ever seen written. And if ever I'm granted a memorial after I've died, I would want these words on the memorial. They are so beautiful. And indeed, the Sullivan Memorial, which is based outside the Savoy Hotel on the Embankment in London, have the words to this piece, "Is life a boon?" So that again is I think, a pretty good feeling how they both felt about each other. It was such a brilliant and clever partnership. We can just go on. We're talking a lot about Gilbert's words and the fact they were always something of meaning and something he wanted to talk about, which is vital. But of course, don't let's forget Sullivan's music. I hope you've enjoyed some of those pieces from the video clip that I sent through to you, which are all 2019 productions. But Sullivan's music is sublime. It is so cleverly done. And or sometimes people say, isn't it so that Sullivan felt debased by having to write for Gilbert? Absolutely not. Sullivan put his all into the music he wrote for these shows. And if you ask any musician when they are playing that music, they will say it is the most complicated and most difficult pieces that they have to do. You cannot go wrong. There's no room for error. Every note has to be observed and every note is there. And it is very intricately done, so cleverly done. Queen Victoria said to Arthur Sullivan, "Sir Arthur, you should write a grand opera. You'd be so good at it." So being a dutiful servant, Sullivan wrote a grand opera. It was called Ivanhoe. And it was produced about the same time as the Gondoliers. It played for about 160 performances. It's not generally recognized anymore. I don't think it's even been reproduced since the Victorian times. But it's interesting when people say, oh, Sullivan felt debased by the music he did with Gilbert. Not so, you see. After he'd written the grand opera Ivanhoe, somebody said to Sullivan, I'm so glad you wrote a grand opera. I think it is so good. And Sullivan said, well, it's more than I think it is. A cobbler should stick to his last. And he went back with Gilbert and carried on and wrote the Gondoliers. And of course, the Gondoliers were infinitely more successful than Ivanhoe had ever been. What a brilliant partnership. They carried on in 1893 with Utopia. Utopia is a show which is not very often produced, but it is a wonderful piece. And the reason it's not produced very much is because there are 16 principals. So it's an expensive show to put on. I understand that Scottish Opera have plans to have a concert performance of Utopia. It was to have been last year. I don't know if they're going to manage it this year, but it's certainly on the books. They're doing it, and they're also doing a new production of the Gondoliers. They will be wonderful shows to see. Scottish Opera produced the most excellent GNS. They've done others, and I'm sure the Gondoliers and Utopia will be fantastic performances. I hope they get ahead this year as their plans are. But Utopia was a wonderful piece because it was Gilbert again with wonderful tongue-in-cheek talking about a desert island in the South Pacific where the country's not doing terribly well. And the king says to his courtiers, what should we do? And the courtiers say, let's import the British system of politics. We'll have two political parties. They'll make everything right. And so they do just that. And after 6 months, the king said, I think we'd be better off with cannibals. Let's get rid of the politicians. Gilbert was still at it, still trying, but he was doing more than that. In Utopia, he talked about bad business practices. He talked about the Victorian business practices of always setting a business up with very little capital so that when they went bust, they didn't have to pay anybody. You know, things that are so pertinent to the present day. Never trust a banker, he said. Give them your money on a Friday and they've lost it for you by the Monday. You know, it's just resolute through to the day. 1896 was the Grand Duke, and that became the end of the partnership for the simple reason, or the sad reason, that by then Sullivan was suffering a period of very serious ill health. And Arthur Sullivan died in 1900 he was only 58. And on Queen Victoria's instructions, he was buried with full honours in St Paul's Cathedral. Gilbert's work in the theatre ended, of course, and Gilbert's life went full circle. He went back to the law. He became a magistrate. And finally, in 1907, King Edward VII knighted Gilbert, and the citation for the knighthood said, "For your services as a magistrate," with no mentioning of his 25 years in the theatre. Gilbert was upset. He never wanted to be called Sir William, and he carried on being WS. And he died in 1911, and he was buried just in a family grave in Stanmore in North London with no recognition whatsoever. But it's not about legacy, about that. The fact is that here we are in the 21st century, celebrating their works and still enjoying their works. And that is the beauty of the pieces. It's the recognition of what absolute geniuses Gilbert and Sullivan were. Gilbert as a writer and Sullivan as a composer, and coming together. Here we are, though, thinking that in 21st century times, how do you produce the shows? They were, after all, Victorian shows, but how do you do it now in the 21st century? Well, I hope that when you've seen the video, and when the Scottish Opera production comes out this year as well, I'm sure it will be along the same lines. All modern productions are absolutely true to the Gilbert words and the Sullivan music. They are not changed, but it's the style of production that is changed, and that is right. I mean, it would be crazy here in 2021 to produce a show as if it was in 1881. I mean, for example, when they were first written, the Victorian theatre stages were very, very small. You couldn't have much movement. You couldn't do very much. But now you can have the most fantastic movement. You can have choreography. You can have production shots. You can have wonderful lighting effects. And these were used to the full to make the shows completely different. But the important thing is sticking to the original words and the original music. If it isn't broke, don't mend it kind of style, you know. And I think that works generally. There is just one song which tends to be altered, and that is in The Mikado, where the character Coco has a little list of characters who would never be missed, talking about Victorian politicians and Victorian people of the time. Gilbert said that must always be updated. It was written in 1885. Gilbert lived to 1911. And in that 26 years, he was forever updating that song. So now it's only right that song is updated. So when you see it now, the singer will probably rewrite it once a week based on whatever the local news is. And that's right. And that's in the spirit of the piece. And I think it's quite fun that we should do it like that and keep the thing relative from that point of view. And that is acceptable to do. I said that GNS is popular worldwide, and so it is.